Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a very, very interesting event where we are hearing about very different studies. And what I'm going to tell you is briefly about the Wirral Child Health and Development Study. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the thinking we started with and the thinking that we have gone through. Because the thing about longitudinal studies is they occur over time. The field changes, our understanding changes, and so we adapt. And then I'm very briefly going to show you some findings. So this is the Wirral. It's just across the water from Liverpool, and it's a good area to work in if you want socio-demographic mix, but not ethnic difference. So in our case, with a smaller sample, we didn't want that difference because unless you have enough, like they have in Bradford, you can't really do the comparison. So actually it's a very white area, but the proportion of deprivation of those in the poorest quintile is exactly the same as in Bradford, and that is downtown Birkenhead, particularly where the study is situated. Okay, so this is I'm now at the University of Reading. I was in Liverpool at the time that we started. Helen Sharp, my co-investigator, is still in Liverpool. Andrew Pickles, the statistician, is at King's. And we're also called the First Step Study. And if you want to see the publications and lots of information about the study, if you just Google First Steps, Wirral First Steps or something like that. This is the team out on a good time in Liverpool. Always a flamboyant collection of people. I'm showing my age, aren't I? Some of you don't even know what that is. Okay. So this in outline is the study. We recruited 1,200 or so first-time mothers. It was important to us these were first-time, so these were not. These were families that had not had previous experience of parenting. And the design is one, it's called a two-stage stratified design, in which we follow up a larger group with somewhat briefer measures, and then we have a stratified subsample that we follow up with more intensive measurement. And I can tell you a bit about that. So that we started at 20 weeks with the 1,200 odd, and then so the 32 weeks was a subsample of about 300 odd, 316, who about half of whom were reporting that they're experiencing psychological abuse in their partner relationships. And we've continued through with these measurements. As you can see, a lot of measurement in infancy, and then somewhat less frequent measurement up to age 7, where we're just now finishing the age 9 assessments, and it's roughly the same numbers, about 800 in the larger sample and about 300 in what we call the intensive sample. So why do this? Now, I think there's an interesting dilemma about cohort studies. On the one end, they are general purpose. That is to say, they're set up with an idea that a certain amount of measurement could well turn out to be useful, but with not a lot of specific hypotheses in mind. And at the other end is study that is hypothesis-driven, where one's really wanting to test some particular ideas. And we are somewhat in the middle, and that's had interesting implications for funding, where the MRC overall has funded us enthusiastically, but we've just hit a little blip where they are basically saying to us, well, you're small for a general purpose cohort, and we're not so sure that we are interested in your more hypothesis-driven work. And that's an interesting discussion, which I can tell you more about. But a lot of what we're interested in really is trying to understand developmental pathways over up to age 9 to aggressive behavior problems, antisocial behavior problems. That was the purpose of the study. what we're trying now to get funding to go for is to move into adolescence, where the key issue is the emergence of depression in girls. Really striking onset from age 11 to 13. But as you can see, and I can only summarize really here, a lot of measurement of a range of functions. And what were our starting points? Well, our starting point was actually a wish to study partner violence and its contribution, taking account, and I think this is a key thing in thinking about these sorts of this sort of processes, that whatever we look at is commonly associated with a lot of other things. It's quite difficult to disentangle one thing from another. So in this case, for example, we had a major emphasis on personality functioning alongside partner violence. And we just published a paper on this in relation to maternal depression. Maternal depression is strongly associated with personality difficulties, and our evidence is that it's the personality difficulties rather than the depression that predicts the behavioural outcomes. But the general point is that you can't just study one thing, because risks occur together, and families with one risk generally have several. Prenatal stress and fetal origins, this has been a huge area of interest, and it's a very intriguing one. And I'm more and more, based on general evidence, our evidence, and animal studies, do think that there are long-term fetal contributions of fetal conditions to emotional and behavioural outcomes. And obviously we were interested in the contributions of parenting quality. Attachment status is particularly important to study because it's such a focus of early intervention at the moment, and a big question as to whether that is justified. Influences over time on us as the study developed. Huge interest a few years ago in epigenetics, fueled by animal work, suggesting that early maternal behaviours modified gene expression. Excuse me, I've got quite a cold, as you can tell, so I'm a bit hoarse. And quite a lot of what we've done has been influenced by that. I'm not going to talk about that today, but it's an interesting and intriguing question still as to whether that animal evidence of experience-based modification of gene expression really has an important contribution to make to emotional and behavioural problems in children. Sex differences. This is an area that we have more and more got into. The most striking thing about child and adolescent mental health problems is that before puberty, it's boys more than girls, and it's externalizing problems, aggression, hyperactivity, those sorts of difficulties, mainly autism. Also, after puberty, it's girls, mainly depression and similar problems, and we really don't understand well enough why there is that difference. But either of these things, modification by early environments of prenatal effects and sex differences, imply examination of statistical interactions. And I'm sure you don't want me to go into a technical discussion here, but that has implications for your sample size and statistical power. However, as clinicians, I mean, I'm a clinician, we commonly create distinctions in terms of what might be helpful to one person rather than another. We think in statistical interaction. We think conditionally. We think that it's not that an intervention or an experience is likely to have an overall uniform effect. So it's a major issue for the design of these studies is, are you going to hypothesize interactions? Further key things is, we talk about mental health problems in children and adolescents, but we really have very little handle on how to characterize them. And increasingly, those broad sort of characterizations that we use, like externalizing problems, are appearing to be heterogeneous. There's very important differentiations or distinctions within these broad brush characterizations. And the risk is if we don't attend to those, we will miss important associations because our outcomes are too broad. Similarly, almost certainly, early experiences of parenting probably depend on which aspects of parenting you're looking at. So we're looking at differential kinds of exposure and differential outcomes. So this is not a question of has the child experienced good parenting and have they got good or poor outcomes, but how can we specify pathways? And that's a lot of where we've moved to. And I think that's a very big challenge to planning a cohort study. Is one going to look at broad brush risks and broad brush outcomes, or is one going to hypothesize specific pathways? So I'm just going to illustrate this with just a small number of findings from our study, some of them published and some of them not, here just to get a feel for what it's like following these kids. And of course, what we do with all the kids who are videoed, the families have the video. So this family has a video of this young man now up to age 9. Okay, so apologies if this looks rather complicated, but I hopefully can make a point here. What we're looking at here is prenatal anxiety and low birth weight, both risks that probably implicate HPA axis glucocorticoid mechanisms in relation to autonomic reactivity. And if that's doesn't mean a lot to you, let's just leave it there. We're looking at a regulatory mechanism, a possible regulatory mechanism for emotional regulation. But the key point here, and this is the sex difference story that we are repeatedly finding now, it's very consistent with the animal literature, that elevated risks, either the anxiety or the low birth weight, are associated with increases in this reactivity in girls and decreases in boys. Opposite directions. Now, if this kind of sex difference is pervasive, then we can't afford to ask our developmental questions across boys and girls without looking at them separately. Now, what we recently published was the follow-on from this. So what's the implication that the girls are more reactive autonomically and the boys are less reactive? Is it the ones protected and ones at risk? Or are they at risk in different ways? And what this is showing oppositional defiant problems. So this is easily angered, disobedient sort of problems that in up to age 5, we know they're associated with long-term behavior problems and later antisocial behaviors. And the answer is the increasing reactivity in girls is associated with problems and the decreasing reactivity in boys. So we are beginning to think that perhaps boys get into trouble because they fail to inhibit aggressive behaviors. Girls get into trouble because they're more reactive and their trouble is more emotionally reactive. So it's an idea, it's a model, but if it's true, again, we can't afford to just look at risks and outcomes without accounting for the possibility that they operate differently in boys and girls. And this is another one showing same thing. Again, apologies if this isn't so easy to interpret. Callous unemotional traits, probably a sub-area of antisocial problems in children. That's an indifference to other people's distress associated with aggression. But what we find is that the boys with low cortisol reactivity, when we stress them, have the highest association with aggression. So there's a sort of double whammy. High callous unemotional traits, lack of responsiveness to other people's emotions, lack of inhibition associated with low cortisol reactivity, the strongest association. And then on the other hand, in boys, the higher cortisol reactivity is protected. It's the reverse in girls. So it's a sex difference, and it's a joint contribution of physiology and emotional responsivity. Let me just show you this. How am I doing for time? I'm doing fine. I kind of feel I should be rushing. Okay, so let's just do a bit more on the callous unemotional traits. So this is a study that's just come out in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry on early mother-infant interactions. I'm sorry there's no numbers on this, you can see it in the paper. Basically, that the more positive and responsive to distress mothers are, the lower the callous unemotional traits later on. So that was what I was showing you earlier, the callous unemotional traits linking to the aggression. and importantly here, there's a link between the positive parenting and attachment, but there isn't an association between attachment and callous unemotional traits, and callous unemotional traits are not linked to negative parenting. So this is specificity. If we're going to study these developmental processes, I would argue we have to look at particular aspects of parenting, we have to look at particular outcomes, rather than a broad brush. Attachment, for those of you who know about this field, huge focus, commonly thought to be important to developmental outcomes in general. In this case, it's got nothing to do with the callous unemotional traits, and I think it's very likely that it's important for some outcomes and not others. So we've got to go for more specificity if we're going to understand the developmental processes. Now, the studies that you're all planning here have an international element, so I just wanted to make two international points. Well, the one international point is that we don't know what differs across countries and what doesn't, or what differs across cultures, or even what differs within the same country and between communities. So I'm just going to show you two illustrations. So we have a parallel study going on in Bangalore, in India, and we've been looking at our videos of mothers and infants at 7 months in Bangalore and on the Wirral. And in order to get blindness between the two, we just did this from transcripts, because obviously it's impossible to do it from videos and remain blind. And basically, what this slide shows is that this comparison here, this is UK and this is India. This is a measure called mind-mindedness. This is how much the parent talks about what they think might be in the mind of the infant, and it's very associated with maternal sensitivity, which I was talking about earlier. UK mothers, this is quite a highly significant difference, because these are very, very tight confidence intervals, are much more mind-minded with their infants than Indian mothers. However, and this isn't subtle, if you watch the videos you'll see that the Indian mothers tell, this is level of instructions, Indian mothers tell their infants how to behave, their 7-month infants how to behave, much more than the UK mothers. And traditionally, that kind of parenting has been seen as not a good thing within the Western influenced literature. But this is the comparison of how positive the parents are. So the Indian mothers are more positive and more instructional and less mind-minded. And I think this is an example of where the cross-cultural study can really raise some questions for us, which challenge assumptions about parenting. And if you look at early intervention programs at the moment in this country and in the USA and so on, they're mostly oriented towards increasing parental sensitivity. They're not oriented towards increasing the number of instructions that parents give their 7 months old. And it's going to be very interesting. 2 minutes? Very interesting within the Wirral study to say, in a UK population, what do higher levels of instructions, controlling for warmth, predict? So I think we can get challenges. At the same time, I have a PhD student in Columbia, and she's looking at callous unemotional traits and oppositional defiant problems. And this is a case where, using measures that have been used internationally, self-report measures, we get a striking specificity that just looks like it could have come from anywhere. In fact, actually, this is the clearest demonstration of specificity, I think, probably in the literature. Basically, here, we're looking at the prediction of callous unemotional traits. Now, this is in cross-section. This will go prospective, but this is the cross-section. Basically, what this shows is the positive aspects of parenting are associated with callous unemotional traits, controlling for oppositional defiant disorder. Harsh physical punishment has nothing to do with callous unemotional traits. And that's pretty much what a lot of the literature says at the moment. On the other hand, if the outcome is oppositional defiant problems, the harsh physical punishment is strongly associated with the oppositional defiant problems, and the positive parenting not at all. So in this case, we have a specificity story in Colombia, and actually 3 regions of Colombia, this sample's about 300, that is completely recognizable from what we know. So, from other studies, even though it adds to them. So, I think my messages are that there are decisions to be made in doing cohort studies. There are values to large, broad brush studies, and there are values to smaller, more focused studies. Whatever we do, I think it's very important to have hypotheses about specificity. Things like sex differences, if they turn out to be right, actually going in opposite directions, mean that we can't just analyse across whole samples without paying attention to them. The cross-cultural question, I think, is open. I think there's a fascinating set of issues about what it is that's common across cultures and communities within this country and internationally. What are the processes that are common? What are the processes that are different? Thank you.